So let's quickly remind ourselves of the kind of questions we want to bear in mind as we approach that wonderful novel of hers. To what degree is the work a product of the language culture that produced it? What kind of image does it project of the cultures or countries the writer is traveling to? And you will see that in this novel there is actually a lot of imagining what it will be like once the destination is reached. What larger socio-historic phenomena is the work responding to or a product of? What ultimately motivates the act of traveling? And then, somewhat more specific, why did a German writer travel to France and ultimately Mexico in the 1930s? Why did Anna Seghers write an account of what she and many others experienced? What kind of account? How does her work differ from readings of previous weeks in terms of focus, style, audience, and mood? And I think especially the style is really quite interesting and quite novel. What can her work tell us about 1930s Germany, France, the world? What kind of picture or critique does she paint of the times, the people her narrator encounters? And how do we, as 21st century readers, react to Anna Seghers' depiction of the plight of refugees, their fears and their desperation, the indifference and cruelty of the people around them, but also sometimes the compassion and kindness of those around them? And here you have a photo of Anna Seghers from the mid-1930s. Now, before we plunge right into our novel, let me say one word. You will see that I'm always quoting the page numbers here, and I quote two numbers. So the first number refers to the PDF number of the PDF that I have posted to iLearn, and the second number refers to the page number from the actual book. So if any of you actually wants to purchase a novel or maybe has a copy, so the page numbers are not quite the same. Our first page number refers to the PDF that is available to all of you. So let's look at the opening. They are saying that the Montreal went down between Dakar and Martinique. She ran into a mine. The shipping company isn't releasing any information. It may just be a rumor. But when you compare it to the fate of other ships and the cargoes of refugees which were hounded over all the oceans and never allowed to dock, which were left to burn on the high seas rather than being permitted to drop anchor merely because the passengers' documents had expired a couple of days before, then what happened to the Montreal seems like a natural death for a ship in wartime. That is, if it isn't all just a rumor. And provided the ship in the meantime hasn't been captured or ordered back to Dakar. In that case, the passengers would now be sweltering in a camp at the edge of the Sahara. So a few interesting things here. You will see that the word rumor comes up all the time in our novel, right? And this lack of concrete information for our narrator, that nobody ever really knows what's going on, has any concrete information, but so much of the decisions that these people are taking are based on rumors. The other thing, of course, is the centrality of ships. Ships that possibly could take these refugees to safety, or sometimes, like the Montreal, could take them to safety and then would sink, or something unforeseen would happen. And maybe the reason why Anna Seghers made this part of the novel is because these things just happened all the time. There is a photo here on the right of a ship, of a very real ship called the St. Louis, which was a liner of the Hapag, German shipping line. And the St. Louis had been chartered to take Jewish refugees to Cuba in 1939. However, after a 2-week-long journey, when these refugees arrived in Cuba, they weren't allowed to disembark because Cuban visa regulations had been changed shortly because the ship's arrival, and only 29 passengers were actually permitted to enter. The captain of the ship and Jewish rescue organizations then appealed to the US, to Canada, to accept those Jewish refugees, but to no avail, and eventually the ship returned to Europe. Now eventually, those refugees on board were granted visas by Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and Great Britain. And there's a newspaper clipping here on the right from the New York Times. 907 refugees quit Cuba on liner. Ship reported hovering off coast. Rumor that United States will permit entry is spread to avert suicides. Company orders St. Louis back to Hamburg, right? So you have newspaper article talking about these events in real time. And then, tragically, of course, with the occupation of Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, not long after, the majority of those immigrants actually came under the control of the Nazi regime, and many ended up being killed. And here I want to show you another document. This is actually a German passport, and you have the J stamped in there that marked the holder of the passport as a Jew. And this is a photo of the St. Louis as she docks in Belgium after her odyssey. And this is just such a tragic photo, right? You see these people, and these people suddenly have faces and stories, and you see some and they're waving and they're cheerful, and you see some that are in despair and some that are fearful, but none of them, of course, knew what really lay ahead. And all they had was probably just rumors, right? Rumors that they heard and picked up somewhere. And it's those rumors, of course, that we hear over and over again in our novel as well, and that inform the decisions of the people in the novel. There was a rumor, a hope, that this faraway nation of Mexico would take in all Republican Spaniards. There were also ships ready to sail in the harbors of Bordeaux, and they now felt they were all under such powerful protection that not even the Germans could interfere with their departure. And old, emaciated, yellow-skinned Spaniards said bitterly that it was all nonsense. Although there might be visas available because Mexico now had a popular government, unfortunately, you couldn't receive a safe conduct from the Germans. In fact, quite the contrary had happened. The Germans were capturing Spaniards here and in Brussels and handing them over to Franco. Then another man, a young one with round black eyes, called out that the ships were not in Bordeaux but in Marseille, and they were ready to sail. He even knew their names: República, Esperanza, Pasionaria. So again, the rumors. People acting on rumors they hear. And by the way, the Spaniards that are referred to here are refugees from the Spanish Civil War, who also had sought refuge in France after Franco had been victorious. And then a little further down, I had a coffee, standing up with a suitcase clamped between my legs. All around me I heard people talking. It was as if the counter where I was drinking stood between two pillars of the Tower of Babel, right? All those refugees from all over Europe speaking different languages. Nevertheless, there were occasional words I could understand, and they kept hitting my ears in a certain rhythm, as if to impress themselves on my memory. Cuba visa and Martinique, Oran and Portugal, Siam and Casablanca, transit visa and 3-mile zone. So here it is, Casablanca, place where you might be able to get a transit visa. And this question of visa and transit visa and exit visa, as I already said, is really central to this novel. Let's read another little passage. He had already had a work contract, so this is one of the people we will encounter in the book. Before and because of the contract, a visa, and because of the visa, a transit visa. But it took so long for the exit visa to be issued that the transit visa expired in the meantime, and after that the visa, and after that the contract. Last week he was issued an exit visa, and he was now anxiously waiting for an extension of his contract, which would mean he could then get an extension of his visa, and that would be a prerequisite for his being awarded a new transit visa. Confused, I asked what he meant by exit visa. He stared at me in delight. I was an ignorant newcomer, he said, but by giving him the opportunity for a long explanation, I would be filling up many lonely minutes for him. He said, "It's a permission to leave France. Didn't anybody tell you anything, my poor young man?" So you see that getting a visa to a country that might accept you was only part of the struggle, right? You needed an exit visa to be allowed to leave the country in which you found yourself. And just as important, you had to get transit visas that would allow you to pass through other countries. Like that transit visa through Japan that Sugihara was issuing to Jewish refugees in Lithuania. One other thing that the novel does is it chronicles really the plight and the hardship of refugees on their odyssey through countries like France that at first had been safe havens and then were occupied by the Germans. You know, of course, what unoccupied France was like in the fall of 1940. So unoccupied France, you remember, was the southern part that was not quite occupied by the Germans, but had formed a collaboration regime with the Germans. The city's train stations, their shelters, and even the public squares and churches were full of refugees. They came from the north, the occupied territory, and the forbidden zone, from the département of Alsace, Lorraine, and Moselle. And even as I was fleeing to Paris, I realized these were merely the remnants of those wretched human masses, as so many had died on the road or on the trains. But I hadn't counted on the fact that many would also be born on the way. While I was searching for a place to sleep in the Toulouse train station, I had to climb over a woman lying among suitcases, bundles and piles of guns, nursing a baby. How the world has aged in this single year. The infant looked old and wrinkled, the nursing mother's hair was grey, and the faces of the baby's two little brothers watching over her shoulder seemed shameless, old and sad. Old also were the eyes of those two boys for whom nothing had been concealed, neither the mystery of death nor the mystery of birth. And then a little later, a tireless pack of officials was on the move night and day, like dog catchers, intent on fishing suspicious people out of the crowds as they passed through, so as to put them into city jails from which they'd be dragged off to a concentration camp if they didn't have the money to pay the ransom or to hire a crafty lawyer who would later split the outsized reward for freeing the prisoner with the dog catcher himself. So you'll get these glimpses of misery, of death, of fear, of anxiety, of hopelessness, of being helplessly at the mercy of corrupt officials. And all that makes this novel so visceral, makes it so real. Now, interestingly, at the same time, we have passages like this. I walked with the crowds, buffeted by a wind that blew first sunshine, then showers over us in rapid succession. And the lightness brought on by hunger and exhaustion turned into an exalted grand buoyancy that enabled the wind to blow me faster and faster down the street. When I realized that the blue gleam at the end of the Canebière was the old harbour and the Mediterranean, I felt at last, after so much absurdity, madness and misery, the one genuine happiness that is available to everyone at any time, the joy of being alive. So we have this juxtaposition then from time to time of extreme misery and fear and absurdity, and also moments of beauty and hope and joy. And it's of course this hope that made all these people go on, that almost always makes people, in no matter how hopeless a situation, to go on. And maybe that's one of the powers of this novel, that it does leave us with hope. To see the hope, you have to read all through the end of the novel. Now, I only assigned the first two parts, that is the first 40 or so pages of the book, and I think in the PDF it's about the first 30 pages. So those you have to read, but I encourage you to read the whole book. If not now, then maybe over the summer. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. So here I included one more map that shows you France as it was split up by the Germans, right? So here you have that line, and here you have the free zone or Vichy France, and here of course you have Marseille, where our narrator ends up. Now, when I introduced the questions for today, I also asked you about the relevance of the book for us today. And Peter Conrad, the person who wrote the introduction to this work, actually reminds us of this. He says, today, the characters Seghers describes are everywhere. People smugglers cram them into airless trucks and drive them between continents. They wade across the Rio Grande, or crowd into Liku boats to travel from Cuba to Florida, or from Indonesia to Australia, or from North Africa to Italy. Those of us who travel for pleasure, rather than to save our lives, have our own reasons for sympathizing with transit. And I'm sure you all must have heard news about those unfortunate refugees from war-torn Syria and places of drought and famine and other places in Africa trying to get into Europe, many of them drowning along the way, or people desperately trying to flee from civil war in Central America, or just out of economic desperation try to cross over into America. Some of you might even have seen the recent Netflix movie Immigration Nation, which of course discusses some of these complex issues. And of course the issues are complex, but I think one thing that transit can do is it can make us sympathize. It can make us feel empathy with these people and their struggles and their fears and their anxieties and oftentimes hopelessness. This novel was actually very recently turned into a wonderful movie called Transit. And if you don't have time to read the entire novel now, I strongly urge you to watch that movie. You can watch it for free via our library site. I posted a link to iLearn and on the PowerPoint. You can also watch it for a couple of dollars on Amazon Prime or on YouTube. You won't be disappointed. The movie is actually very close to the novel, with the only exception it's set in today's France, which makes it strangely relevant, but I won't tell you too much. Please watch it. Now we're already over time, but I wanted to leave you with a poem. Every emigrant, every exile leaves behind a home. And sometimes, and no matter what you've experienced in that home, it's usually difficult to entirely forget or to erase the memory of your home. And sometimes exiles return home. And here is a poem of a German Jewish poetess called Masha Kaleko, who left Germany in 1938, emigrated to the United States, and in 1974 she returned to Berlin for a visit. And I'm going to read out the German for you, and the English is here on the right, so you can follow along. And as a bonus question, for bonus points in our iLearn quiz, maybe you can reflect on the emotion Masha Kaleko experiences as she returns to her home after all those years. Bleib treu heißt die Straße. Vor fast 40 Jahren wohnte ich hier. Zupft mich was am Ärmel, wenn ich so für mich hin den Kurfürstendamm entlang schlendere, heißt wohl das Wort. Und nichts zu suchen, das war mein Sinn. Und immer wieder das Gezupfe, sei doch vernünftig, sage ich zu ihr. 40 Jahre, ich bin es nicht mehr. 40 Jahre. Wie oft haben meine Zellen sich erneuert inzwischen, in der Fremde, im Exil. New York, 96th Street und Central Park, Minetta Street in Greenwich Village und Zürich und Hollywood und dann noch Jerusalem. Was willst du von mir? Bleib treu. Ja, ich weiß. Nein, ich vergaß nichts. Hier war mein Glück zu Hause und meine Not. Hier kam mein Kind zur Welt und musste fort. Hier besuchten mich meine Freunde und die Gestapo. Nachts hörte man die Stadtbahnzüge und das Horst-Wessel-Lied aus der Kneipe nebenan. Was blieb davon? Die rosa Petunien auf dem Balkon, der kleine Schreibwarenladen und eine alte Wunde, unvernarbt.